Cancer!
The Science Task Force has had monthly teleconference calls for a couple of years, maybe 3 years now. And the person who was least likely to be on the phone was the most reliable. From Melbourne, Australia, between his midnight and 5 a.m., the opposite side of the world and the opposite time frame, was David Thomas, director of the On Track at Peter Mac, the Peter MacCallum Cancer Institute in Melbourne, and the chair of the disease subgroup for Ewing and osteosarcoma. Coming live via San Antonio is David Thomas. David?
Should I say hello from Melbourne, Australia? This is an example of a disruption in the space-time continuum. I'm not only a long way away from you, but I'm also removed in time. This is currently just turning October, so hello to the future. I can't be with you in Austin this year, and I'm very sorry about that, but I think we calculated I'd be doing 40,000 kilometers of traveling the week before the LAF meeting and about 40,000 the week afterwards. And since I've already had 2 deep vein thromboses from airline travel, I'm trying to minimize it as much as I can. And I know that Danny Indelicato will be presenting in more detail the research that has been funded through the generosity of the Livestrong Foundation. So I'm just going to briefly now tell you a little bit about what we've done and what we've learnt. So it was one of the recommendations of the Progress Review Group back a few years ago that we should take advantage of existing research that was already lying unexplored in vaults and in archives to try and look at the issues that face adolescent young adults with various cancers, including sarcomas. And through a combination of fate and good luck, it happened to be my fortune to be responsible for looking into osteosarcoma and Ewing sarcoma, 2 of the major sarcomas that affect adolescents and young adults, and 2 diseases with amongst the highest lethalities in this age group. So certainly very worthy candidates for research. For various reasons, we ended up focusing on osteosarcoma, and we managed to pull together 16 clinical trials and a little over 2,200 patients worth of data from those trials, and we're able to therefore parse out what had happened to the young adult group as opposed to children or older populations in those studies. And what we learnt was that, in fact, somewhat to our surprise, the group that did worst of all was the adolescent group, not the young adult group, but the group that was undergoing the growth spurt. And of course, the skeleton grows at this maximal rate during that growth spurt, so there may be something about the biology of osteosarcoma when it occurs in adolescence itself, which lends that adverse outcome. The second thing that we observed was that boys and girls are not the same, and it might seem that we've taken a while to understand that. Probably 25 years worth of medical education and training, and I finally understand that girls and boys are different. What we learned was that women, young women, did better than any other single group, and they did significantly better than young men. And we didn't understand what this was all about. Clearly it wasn't the case for girls and boys, and the effect seemed to magnify as people went through puberty. And then all of a sudden, in a eureka moment, it became clear that one of the key features of the boundary between childhood and adulthood was in fact developing your secondary sexual characteristics, becoming either a woman or a man. And so it wasn't surprising that perhaps there were factors about gender which were relevant to the outcomes that we'd seen in older groups compared to children with the same diseases. One of the important possibilities that we considered was whether that effect could be related to the sensitivity to chemotherapy. For various reasons, and including some previous research, we felt that chemosensitive cancers, that is, cancers in which chemotherapy was critical to cure, there seemed to be this generic phenomenon of differences in survival rates between men and women. It was true for Hodgkin's lymphoma, it's also true for Ewing sarcoma, and it was certainly true in our study for osteosarcoma. We found that there was a relationship between the toxicities experienced by women and men that might correlate with those adverse outcomes. Very briefly, what we found was that for the same dosing, we don't discriminate between men and women when we dose with chemotherapy. Using those same dosing schedules, women experienced much higher toxicities. In fact, there were higher treatment-related death rates, just as there are higher treatment-related death rates for children than there are for for adults, and that those increased toxicities from the same dosing of chemotherapy were also associated with increased evidence of cancer cell death when we treated patients. So it seemed almost as though chemotherapy was more effective in women than it was in men, and that was a systematic effect and correlated to some extent with the differences in survival. All of which leads us to a very practical conclusion. That is that if we know that women and men have different sensitivities to chemotherapy, we may be inappropriately assuming that they're the same with respect to our treatments. In fact, we are using chemotherapy, some of the most toxic drugs that we can possibly prescribe in medicine, in a relatively indiscriminate way. We don't have to develop new treatments. We don't have to understand the biology of the tumor. We may just have to use the drugs that we are already using a little bit better to try and reduce that difference in outcome between men and women. And finally, I'd like to say that somewhat surprisingly, and different from the information we were getting from registry, population data in Australia at least, we were finding that children and adults as a whole did exactly as well as each other on these clinical trials. And again, that suggests to me that either where people are presenting later in the general community, where they're being stratified by their stage, so they're equivalent on clinical trials, or that being on a clinical trial enforced a degree of rigor that, when applied to adults as it is routinely applied to children, results in equivalent outcomes. We just need to get more of these young people onto clinical trials.